In the years I've been looking at photo modes, I have never, ever seen people wanting a photo mode in a game more than I have with Stellar Blade. And I can't help but wonder why. Anyway, now that your degenerate prayers have been answered, let's take a look at Stellar Blade's photo mode and see what we can learn from it. My name is Mir, and let's get started, shall we? Now, there are actually two cameras you have access to. One is your typical photo mode free range camera, and then the other one is more of a selfie one. And to access the selfie one, head to the Xi'an region and go to the bulletin board where you will get a special reward camera. Once you get the selfie camera, what you need to do is hold down on the D-pad, select the camera, and then push down again to access the camera. Now the rest of the settings I'm going to explain in the free range photo mode, but here I still do want to highlight some of the selfie pictures you can take and some of the controls here. So on this camera tab you have FOV, or the field of view, and if you go to the left you zoom in, and if you go to the right you zoom out. And here's something that I actually really appreciate: when you start moving the camera, Eve starts moving her hand too, that way it looks a lot more natural taking that selfie. And that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the arm, nothing else. If you hold R2 and the left stick, you can actually frame the image differently, so you can move Eve around. And if you hold R2 and the right stick, you can actually tilt her head. So once you finish this tutorial request with the selfie camera, you will get another outfit, and it will unlock more requests to get additional outfits as well. To access the photo mode with the free range camera, go ahead and pause the game, go to settings, and then go down to photo mode. You can also hold R1 and press the left D-pad to quickly access it in the game. So let's kick things off in the camera tab. So the first thing we want to do is actually hit R3, and this will bring up a grid. If you're on a phone watching this, this is going to be very hard to see, so I'll move the camera around. But you can see these dotted lines that take up the screen. This here is the rule of thirds. Now, it's not a definite rule, you're allowed to break it, but basically it's here to help you compose your shot. So the first setting here on the camera tab is your camera roll, and if you move it left and right, it basically just rotates the image. Next is your FOV, or your field of view, and if you move to the right, you have your wide angle, and if you move to the left, you have your telephoto. Let's say I put Eve right here, and it's FOV 35, so the field of view is smaller, you're on the telephoto side of things. This introduces your telephoto compression, where your foreground and your background, they look like they're compressed, they look like they're right next to each other. If I move the camera to the wide angle side of things, this introduces your wide angle distortion, where your foreground and your background, they're distorted, they look like they're further away from each other. Where I would recommend you use your FOV is that if you go for a wide angle shot, use it for more like this, where it's the environment. You're trying to capture the environment around the subject. Whereas telephoto, where you're zoomed in, is great for portraits or highlighting very specific accent pieces. Next, let's move on to the shutter tab. And here you have depth of field. So when you turn it on, it goes into autofocus and it focuses straight onto Eve's face. Now, if we move the camera and we get closer, what you'll start to notice is that the background starts to blur. This blur in photography is known as bokeh. This autofocus is actually really fantastic, and I wish more games had stuff like this, where it changes the bokeh on the fly. Now, so far I have noticed one thing, which I believe is a bug. If we go to FOV and we leave it default, the autofocus works just fine. If we go to FOV, go into the wide angle, again, autofocus is working just fine. But for some reason, if you go into the telephoto side, let's move the camera back, and we move closer, you'll notice that the bokeh doesn't naturally transition. It just turns on and off. So I hope this is something that gets fixed in maybe a future update, but I'm pretty sure this is just a bug. Next is your focus distance, and if you move it to the left, the focus actually gets closer to you, and if you move it to the right, it moves further away into the screen. After that, you have focus visualization, which I think is the best feature in this entire photo mode. and more photo modes needed. So if you turn this on, you can actually see where the focus is being applied. So if you move the focus distance around, you'll see exactly what is in focus. In a real camera, this is usually known as focus peaking or focus highlighting. Now, if I move the camera back and I start messing with the focus distance, you can actually see a line on the ground that shows you that focus visualization, where exactly the focus is going to be. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on Eve or any of the characters. You can actually use this to focus the environment as well. This is a fantastic feature, and more photo modes definitely need this. Now, one thing to note, if you leave the focus visualization on and you move to other tabs, that visualization is still there. So definitely turn it off before you move to another tab. Next is your aperture, and these numbers, like this 0.5 here, these numbers represent f-stops, which is what it's often referred to on a real camera. The smaller the number, the more blur you're going to see in the background, and the higher the number, more will be in focus in the background. Next is your motion blur intensity. Let me change this scene so you can see what I'm talking about. So motion blur won't be activated until there is something in motion. So Eve here is doing an attack. So if we change the intensity, if we go to the left, you'll notice that the motion blur on her sword starts to go away. Whereas to the right, you can actually add more blur if you want. So let's move on to the display tab. Here you have the option to take the picture in HDR, which my capture card can't show it, but you have the option there. Next is your exposure, and typically you'll see exposure in some sort of photo editing software, and you can use this as like your brightness, but this is mainly referring to the highlights, like the brightest parts of the scene where it changes that, but the shadows, it doesn't change as much. Next is your contrast, and this is typically the relationship between your highlights and your shadows. So if you increase your contrast, you start to notice a hard defined line between your highlights and shadows. Whereas if you start to go in the opposite direction, that defined line starts to go away and the image starts to mix together and gives you more of like a flat look. Next is your saturation, and this is primarily for your colors. So if you increase your saturation, the color starts to pop out of the screen a lot more. Whereas if you decrease your saturation, the color starts to go away and you can actually go for more of a black and white look. Next is your hue, and this affects the colors where you can actually blend it more towards your greens and magentas. Now, I actually already like the colors of this game, so I probably wouldn't use the hue that much, but the option is there. And if you decide, hey, this hue is a little bit too strong, the hue intensity slider is right underneath and you can adjust how much you want to be applied. Next is your brightness, and this is similar to your exposure, but brightness brightens up your entire screen or darkens your entire screen, whereas your exposure will just be your highlights. So if you still need to make some sort of brightness adjustments, you can do it here, but I would still recommend go for your exposure first and then adjust the brightness after if you need to. Next is your bloom intensity, and this is typically for any sort of bright light. So if you look at the light in the background, if we start increasing the bloom intensity, you'll notice that it starts to give off this glow. And it's not only that light, it's also any sort of reflective surface. So you can notice it in Eve's pants, you can notice it on the ground. Your bloom intensity will amplify these reflective bright lights. And if you decide to go the opposite direction, you can actually minimize it to the point where it's not glowing as much. Next is your sharpness, and personally speaking, I don't think this game needs more sharpness. I think it looks fine as it is, but if you decide you want a little bit more sharpness, the option is there for you. Next is your filter, and there's quite a few colored filters in here, which they actually look pretty good. And what I really like is the fact that you can not only apply the filter to the whole screen, you can actually remove it from the characters themselves if you'd like, and then also you can adjust the intensity. Next is your zoom blur, and if you turn this on, you'll notice that it gives you this blur effect on the entire screen except for the middle, and you can actually adjust the intensity as well, and this would be great for any sort of action scene, any sort of combat scene. So next is your environment transparency, and actually I'm going to change the location to kind of show what it's doing. So from the looks of it, the environment transparency, it's automatically turned on, but if you turn it off, it actually gives you more details into the environment. So when you're running around, I'm assuming the environment has to render at a lower quality, that way the game can run properly. But seeing that you're trying to create a still image, you can bring back some of the details in some instances, that way you can get a nice and clean picture with more detail. This doesn't seem to affect a lot, but the option is there to give you a better quality image. Next is your chromatic aberration, and if you turn this on, you'll notice that the colors on the edges start to distort. This is typically considered a lens defect on a real camera, and in photo editing software, there's usually some sort of check mark to remove chromatic aberration. So if you want this for some sort of artistic look, the option is there for you. Next is your film grain, and same as the chromatic aberration, this is more of an artistic look. So if you turn it on, and let's go ahead and turn the intensity all the way up so you can see it, you have 4 different types of film grain to choose from, and again, this is more of like a personal taste, something artistic you can go for. So let's move on to the decorations tab, and here we have different frames, and they have everything from movie style crop bars all the way to artistic stuff, which these are all fantastic and fit the game really well. Next, you have your copyright, which is actually kind of unique to see in a game, so you can move it left, center, or right, or you can turn it off altogether. It's crazy to see that there's an option for the copyright. I've never seen this in any sort of photo mode. Next, you have your logo, and you actually have 5 options. You have logos 1 through 5, and not only is it the game logo, but there's also stickers as well. And you can put up to 5 on the screen. And the best part, let's say we want the Stellar Blade logo, you can move it around anywhere on the screen, and the absolute best part is that you can change the size. And it just keeps going, and going, and going. Next is your vignette intensity, and this is where the edges of the image start to darken up, where your focus is more on the center of the image. You also have the option to completely turn it off since it adds a subtle vignette right at the beginning. So yeah, use a vignette if you want to highlight the center of the image. So let's move on to the characters tab, and here you have the option to hide or display Eve. Same thing with your drone, Lily if she was in the shot, Adam if he was in the shot, or any other characters on screen. So we'll focus specifically on Eve for this one. This is probably what a lot of people have been waiting for. You have a lot of different poses for Eve, as well as expressions, and if I get a little closer, you also have the option for Eve to look directly at the camera as well. Now for the look at camera option, there's actually 3. You can turn it off, turn it on, and there's one that says fixed line of sight, which took me a little while to figure out, but I realized when you turn it on, Eve is looking at the camera, and when you start moving the camera, she continues to stare at the camera. Now let's say I want her eyes to be here, I turn on the fixed line of sight and I start moving the camera the other way, her eyes don't follow the camera anymore. So you can actually control exactly where she's looking. This is a fantastic feature. I normally don't do expressions in these photo modes, but this is a great one. And for the drone, you have the option to turn on or off the light, and also adjust the intensity of the light too. It's very subtle, but the option is there. So let's move on to the lighting tab, which the lighting feature in this game is actually pretty cool. So let's start off with the world lighting brightness, and I specifically picked this area to show off the lighting. So if we decide to remove the world lighting brightness, it basically removes all the lighting from overhead, from the world, but the lighting that's already inside the world, that stays on. So you'll notice in the background, all the lights are still on. This looks awesome. Alright, so what I'm going to do is keep the world lighting brightness to 0 and move on to the lighting itself. Now you have the option for 3 separate lights, so let's go ahead and activate the first one, and you'll notice that it immediately lights up right behind Eve. So use the left stick to go up, down, left, right, and the right stick to move it into the background or into the foreground. So let's go ahead and move it in front of Eve like this so her face is lit up. So next we have the target, and it's set to all, so it's lighting up both the characters and the environment around it. But if I wanted to, I can set it to just the characters and none of the light falls onto the environment. Next, you have your option to cast the shadow, which you can go ahead and turn it off. Let's say I move the light this way, you can see Eve's legs casting this massive shadow. If I turn it off, you'll notice that the shadow is missing from her face, and it's missing on the legs. Personally speaking, I would leave the shadow on, but the option is there to turn it off. Next, you have your range for the light, and if we move it to the left, what you'll notice is that this circle is starting to decrease, and you'll notice it's also decreasing on Eve as well. So basically, how big of a radius do you want the light to have? And of course, if you go the opposite direction, it'll cast a wider light. Next is your color, and here you have predetermined colors that you can choose for the light. And of course, you have a custom option as well. Next is your saturation, and this is just for the color. So if you go to the right, this will actually increase the color. It'll really make it pop. So if I go to, like, let's say I go to blue, for example, increase the saturation, and yeah, that light is very blue. But I can also do the opposite, where I decrease the saturation and remove the blue, and it becomes more of a neutral color. Next is your brightness, and this is pretty self-explanatory. How bright do you want the light to be? And if we start going to the left, it'll decrease the brightness. And then you have your intensity. So if we start to decrease the intensity, how powerful is the light going to be? Not necessarily the brightness, but how powerful. So if we just inch the intensity just a little bit, you'll notice that it's not really emitting that much light. But then of course, you can just really blast the light if you want to. Next is your scatter, and this took me a little bit of time to figure out, but this is essentially the bloom for the light source itself. And since you have 3 different light sources you can choose from, you can individually choose how much light they scatter. So this is your bloom per light. So if I move the light around, you'll notice the glow that's coming off the light. So if I increase the scatter, yeah, that bloom is only on that light. And of course, I could turn it off if I wanted to. Now, the image that you're seeing on screen was created all within the game. No Photoshop, nothing. And this is actually the thumbnail of this video. So you can actually do quite a bit with this photo mode. If you found this video useful, please like this video, and please check out this playlist of other photo modes that I've looked at in other games. I think that's going to be it for me today, and I'll see you next time.